All right, well, go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our webinar on water contamination and cancer risk. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Rena Jones, who is an investigator in the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch at the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Jones is really an expert on water contamination and cancer risk, but also applying spatial methods to understand cancer patterns across the U.S. So, Dr. Jones, welcome, and please take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm so pleased to be here to, present for a few minutes on this topic and then engage in hopefully a lively discussion. And I've tried to keep it kind of high level with the understanding that we've got a mixed audience and sort of different levels of context for some of the science here. But I'm hoping to leave you with a general sense of what we do know about the relationship between specific water contaminants and risk of specific cancers, and also a little bit of the sort of background on regulation that sort of underpins a lot of that science. So starting with that background, just a brief primer on how our drinking water is regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under the Safe Drinking Water Act, if you're not familiar. So public drinking water supplies in the U.S. that serve at least 25 people are regulated under this law and have been since the 1970s. And there's been an increasing number of contaminants that fall under this, the purview of this law over time. And today there are more than 90 contaminants on the list. And every 6 years, the EPA looks again at the adequacy of regulatory limits for a given chemical. So, in other words, the allowable level of a contaminant in drinking water is reconsidered or reevaluated every few years to take into account new information and new research that might lead to a change in those limits. And public drinking water utilities routinely measure the chemicals in their water to make sure they're meeting these regulatory statutes. Private wells and very small drinking water systems, on the other hand, are exempt from regulation, and there is a small patchwork of state-based regulations, but they're not required under the Safe Drinking Water Act to take measurements. And private wells supply drinking water for about 15% of the U.S. population. They're mostly located in rural and agricultural areas where they can be impacted by pollution from agricultural activity and septic systems. And because they aren't regulated, we have a lot less monitoring or measurement data on water contaminants for private wells. And so we have less information to use for epidemiologic research to investigate relationships with water contaminants and cancer for people that get their water from a private well. And since this is a short presentation, today I'm going to briefly summarize what we know about cancer risks that are associated with two regulated contaminants that are very commonly found in public drinking water supplies in the U.S. That's nitrate and disinfection byproducts. And I'll also talk a little bit about PFAS because I know that that's a very, it's a very timely topic to be discussing today. So starting with nitrate as the first contaminant here, the major sources of nitrate in drinking water are coming from agriculture, so nitrogen fertilizers, as well as animal and human waste. And the regulatory limit for nitrate in drinking water that's set by EPA is called a maximum contaminant level, or an MCL. And that MCL for nitrate was set not based on levels that might lead to cancer, but actually on levels that caused an illness called blue baby syndrome. And this was implemented decades ago. And so I'll note it was a public health success. We haven't had a case of blue baby syndrome in the US in more than 40 years. But because it was not set based on potential cancer risk, we actually don't know if this MCL is adequate to protect against cancer risk. And the population who typically experiences the highest level of exposure to nitrate in drinking water are people who live in agricultural areas where some of these sources are more common, and particularly for people on private wells, since they are not routinely measuring nitrate. And in case you're not familiar, those of us in the cancer space rely very frequently on a group called the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And this is a group that does the sort of summary evidence evaluation to determine whether chemicals are carcinogens or not. They review all of the scientific literature from experimental and human studies, and they make those determinations. And they consider nitrate to be a human carcinogen under specific conditions. And what does that mean, under specific conditions? So nitrate itself is not a carcinogen. It's when we ingest it, our body converts it into the carcinogen, and these are called N-nitroso compounds. And I don't want to belabor the biology or get too technical here, but I wanted to just walk you through that process a little bit because I want to underscore that these processes are very complex, and some of that information really drives how we study associations between water contaminants and cancer. So you ingest nitrate through drinking water, but in your mouth, the bacteria right away break that down to nitrite. So it's called a reduction. And that nitrite sits in your stomach, along with all of the acid and other components in your stomach from food that you've ingested, like amines and amides that come from things like meat. And they form these N-nitroso compounds in your stomach. And so that's where the carcinogens are being formed. But that reaction, that conversion or development of the carcinogens can actually be increased by other factors. So if you're a smoker or you eat a lot of red meat and take in a lot of iron, and other factors like bringing lots of fruits and vegetables into your body, antioxidants can suppress that reaction. So the formation of the carcinogen in the body is not just influenced by the amount of nitrate that you're drinking in your drinking water. It's all of these other factors at play. And so it's as I mentioned, it's a very complex process when we're thinking about, does this chemical cause cancer? And this slide is intended to just give you a sense of how few studies there are of drinking water, nitrate, and cancer that are published from high quality epidemiologic studies. The most consistent evidence is of a link for colorectal and stomach cancers. And there are certainly some hints of associations for things like brain tumors in children and potentially a couple of other cancers in adults. But as you can see, there are not many studies of any one cancer site, especially for, I'll note, the female reproductive cancers like ovarian and uterine cancers, where there have only been one investigation of each cancer to date so far. And most of these studies were conducted in North America and Europe and predominantly include people and exposures on public drinking water because that's where we have the measurement data. So as I mentioned, people who get their water from private wells are often not included in these studies. And I'll take advantage of this opportunity to note that a lot of these studies, a lot of this literature includes contributions from my colleague, Dr. Mary Ward at NCI, who has dedicated much of her career to investigating the association between water nitrate and cancer. Disinfection byproducts are another really common water contaminant. The chlorination of public drinking water is a great public health achievement. But in the 70s, we recognized that chlorine and other disinfectants react with the source water and form byproducts. There are over 600 of these DBPs identified, and many of them have properties that suggest they could be carcinogenic. So they cause damage to the DNA and to cells, for example. So the maximum contaminant levels set by EPA for DBPs in public drinking water are based on concern about cancer risk. So unlike nitrate, they are based on levels thought to be driving cancer. And they have not been regulated as long. So the most common of these compounds are called trihalomethanes. They're chlorinated byproducts. And the EPA started regulating these in the mid-1980s. Another very common class of these chemicals are called haloacetic acids. And so trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids are the two big groups of DBPs that sort of dominate the cancer literature because they're the most common and we have the most measurement data for them. So the epidemiologic studies have mostly focused on ingestion of disinfection byproducts through drinking water and seen an increased risk of bladder cancer associated with exposure. There have been more limited studies for cancers like colorectal and stomach cancers and a few studies of other sites, but very, very limited. And importantly, you can be exposed to DBPs not just by drinking the water, but by showering and bathing and swimming in water that has been, for instance, chlorinated. If you think about it, you're in a hot shower, these chemicals are actually volatilizing in the air and you're breathing them in. So we've in more recent years recognized this as a potentially important route of exposure, but there have been very few studies that actually look at the amount of exposure that you get through these other pathways besides just drinking the water. And on the basis of all of the scientific literature, about 20 years ago, that IARC concluded that some of these trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids were possible human carcinogens. But again, the literature's been quite light. And I'm going to show you a couple figures here. You don't really have to know or understand how to interpret them. I just want to point out the number of studies, even 20 years ago, was quite limited. There were about 5 or 6 studies of bladder cancer. And those studies saw a positive association between trihalomethanes and bladder cancer risk in men, but did not see that association in women. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. The key takeaway is that the pattern was for this bladder cancer association, but it was sex specific. And more recent studies of bladder cancer and DBPs in North America and Europe have mostly been consistent with that finding. Another sort of summary analysis of existing studies found that the trihalomethanes were drivers of increased bladder cancer risk, again, only in men, and at levels below the regulatory limit. That's an important point. And in a study I did among women in Iowa, we found, again, no association between trihalomethanes and bladder cancer in women. But another study that was led by colleagues of mine at NCI, this one conducted in New England, again found increased risk of bladder cancer associated with trihalomethanes exposure. But this time they saw the effect in both men and women. So a little bit different from those prior findings. But again, a very consistent signal for this particular cancer. And last, but certainly not least, I want to talk about PFAS, because in recent years, general public have been very interested in this. Scientists are very interested in these man-made chemicals that we've used for decades, commonly used for things like stain resistance, Teflon coating. They're in firefighting foams, for example. And all of those characteristics that make them really desirable for consumer products make them bad from an environmental perspective. Many of these PFAS are very persistent in the environment. They don't break down easily. They can stick around for years, and that's how they got their name as forever chemicals. And especially relevant to outcomes, health outcomes like cancer, some of them are also biologically persistent. So we can detect them in the body for years after exposure, for example. So the major way we get exposed to PFAS is through drinking water, but we can also get exposed from dietary sources and even airborne PFAS. And in the US, at least, we've known for some time that these chemicals have been present in drinking water, distributed throughout the United States. They've gotten lots of attention. And a few years ago, the US EPA proposed an action plan to evaluate the health risks associated with exposure to PFAS through drinking water. And they have since proposed to regulate 6 PFAS in public drinking water supplies for the first time. And with respect to cancer, we know the most about PFAS that were the most common and the ones that have been around and sticking in the environment for long periods of time. And those most well-studied compounds are 2 chemicals called PFOS and PFOA for short. And they've actually been phased out of use. The major manufacturer of these compounds and their precursors actually voluntarily pulled PFOS from the market in 2002 and PFOA in 2015. And you can actually see that in declines in levels in the blood of Americans through some of our data. So the green line is showing the decline in PFOS levels in blood following the phase out in 2002. And the bluer line is a little harder to see. That decline happened in more recent years since it was more recently phased out. And drinking water is certainly the major exposure source, but because these chemicals have not been regulated, we don't have a lot of measurement data to look at cancer associations with water specifically. So most studies looking at PFAS and cancer measure PFAS in blood. And so that means they're measuring the total exposure that someone has from water, from diet, from other sources. And that helps us to really understand whether the PFAS is causing cancer, but not necessarily if water is the sort of major way that they're being exposed. So studies of any one particular cancer are limited, just like the DBPs and nitrate I spoke about before. And most studies until recently had just looked at those 2 legacy PFAS that have now been phased out. And most recently, the IARC reviewed the state of the science on associations for both of these specific PFAS and cancer and have determined for PFOA that it is a known human carcinogen and that PFOS is a possible human carcinogen. So the evidence is still somewhat lacking for PFOS in particular. And most of the evidence was consistent for kidney and testicular cancers in adults. There's quite a literature on breast cancer, but it's very mixed. Some studies see a link, others don't. And until recently, there had been no studies of childhood cancer. And in fact, there are 2 studies so far. Here I'm showing the results from one, which is actually recently published study of work I led in Finland, where PFAS levels are quite a bit lower than the US. And we looked at the relationship with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in children. And we found no association with those 2 legacy compounds, PFOA and PFOS, the most well-studied of these chemicals. But we saw a 22% increased risk of childhood ALL for every doubling in the serum levels of other kinds of PFAS, specifically one called MIFOSA. And there's the other study of childhood cancer was actually conducted in California and looked at more rare childhood cancer, retinoblastoma, but did see increased risk associated with several of these PFAS as well. So far, the childhood cancer studies are both positive. So I want to just summarize with some key takeaways. I think some themes probably emerged. Very small number of studies on drinking water and cancer, especially for any specific cancer. This is not like we're talking dozens of studies, not hundreds or even thousands of studies. And this is due to the rarity of cancer, the complexity of the biological interactions, like I talked about with nitrate, and just the challenges in having measurement data. But we did note some consistency in the relationship. So for nitrate, there's clear patterns for stomach and colorectal cancers. And for DBPs, that bladder cancer relationship pops up over and over. I think the evidence for PFAS is still growing, but certainly we're seeing some consistent patterns there. And I'll just end by saying, again, these studies are hard to conduct. So it can take decades for the literature to really build up. Ideally, we're talking about evaluating people's contact with these chemicals over decades. And you can imagine people move, they drink different amounts of water, they bathe and shower at different frequencies. And it's very hard to collect that kind of information in epidemiologic studies. So, it's something that we pay attention to, those of us in the water cancer world, in trying to improve studies moving forward so that we can continue to build this body of evidence. So I'll stop there with the slides. Hopefully that was some good background on the basics and what we know. And now we're moving to questions. Is that right?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. That was super informative. I encourage our participants to put questions in the Q&A, and I will ask those to Dr. Jones. And while we wait for questions from our attendees, I'll just maybe start with asking you about what people can do. So that's a lot of, what I think people want to know. We've in many ways been unknowingly exposed to these chemicals, but is there anything that we can do now that we have been exposed, or to limit our exposure in the future?
It's a tough question to answer, and I'm certainly not trying to deflect, but I'll note that it's different for different chemicals, certainly. So if you're, someone that doesn't live, so let's use nitrate as the example. Nitrate levels in drinking water tend to be higher in parts of the country where there's a lot of agricultural activity. So like the Midwest, parts of California, et cetera. And I mentioned that there's sort of a smattering of local and state regulations around some drinking water contaminants. And that is very true for nitrate. So areas of the U.S. where there's nitrate issues, they pay much more attention to this. They measure nitrate in drinking water much more frequently. They have, even tighter regulations or requirements around measurements, even compared to what EPA requires. So it's a known issue and something they pay attention to. And having, given talks in some public spaces in those parts of the country, I know how interested folks are and care about the quality of their water. But it's not something. It's hard, right? Because it's an involuntary exposure. Your choices are to either not touch your water, or if you're on a private well, pay to have it tested. If you're on public drinking water, sort of hope that everybody's following, the letter of the law. You could drink bottled water, but that certainly has potentially other complications, as we're learning, microplastics, other potential exposures. But one thing that I will say about nitrate that has come up before, if you're in a vulnerable subgroup, let's say you're a pregnant woman or, you're immunocompromised or something like that, you could imagine thinking about, more carefully about what might be in your water and drinking bottled water and that sort of thing. But I would be reluctant to give specific advice about, you as an individual need to change anything because we sort of rely on the regulatory infrastructure. And I know that that's, it's easy to say that. And then we have violations, and then we have, situations where there's water contamination events and everybody gets frustrated around that. But by and large, the regulatory infrastructure is set up to protect against very high levels of contaminants. But one of the reasons that we study, we being myself and others at NCI in our group that are doing water studies, we're really trying to study whether we observe effects below those regulatory limits, because putting out high quality research is what EPA is going to use to make determinations of if those MCLs need to come down. So on an individual level, maybe you can't do a lot, but EPA can continue to, very carefully evaluate whether those regulatory standards need to be changed and continue to protect against risk.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. What about filtering water?
Yeah, so the popular, if you think about home filtration, so charcoal filters do pretty well for getting rid of like chlorinated byproducts, like disinfection byproducts. The most efficient kind of home filter to get rid of something like nitrate is reverse osmosis, which is tends to be more expensive, and it's like a system that you have to have installed, and so that's sort of an issue of access and raises questions about people who can afford it have it, and that sort of thing. But certainly RO, reverse osmosis, is most efficient for nitrate, but the charcoal filters do a pretty good job of getting rid of not only organic content, but also some of the chlorinated byproducts.
Super, super helpful. We have a question from one of our attendees who is a colorectal cancer survivor, saying that super interesting, and thank you. And also, they're curious about any studies done on bottled water compared to the public water supply. And I think that's super interesting, because a number of people will, even in their home, use those large bottled water companies. And so what do we know about the relative composition?
Thank you. That's such a great question. And I was alluding to this on my very last slide when I was saying, most of our epidemiologic studies where we query people about, what do you drink and that kind of stuff, it's just really hard to get that kind of information. Oh, I use a Brita, or, twice a month somebody comes and brings, these big 5-gallon jugs to my house. In most of the studies that I've been involved in, the proportion of the amount of people, or the percent of people who are exclusively drinking bottled water, is not very high. It's, 10, maybe 15% compared to the broader group. And what that means for cancer studies, when we're talking about really rare outcomes, is that it can be very hard to be able to find a relationship, if one exists, among such a small subset of people. But there have been exposure studies that have measured what's in bottled water, and there's not a lot of regulation around bottled water, and bottled water has plenty of contaminants in it. And so, if you're sort of leaning on bottled water as being safer for no clear reason, I might encourage you to just look at the public data for the levels of contaminants in your public drinking water to just, they're not so bad, or they're, this much lower, because there's actually a lot less control over what's in bottled water.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly my take on the data that are out there. So
yeah, it's just not a large proportion of people for us to really look at them separately. But maybe that will change.
Yeah, we certainly hope that will change with My Cares, as that a big focus of our first follow-up questionnaire is really understanding more deeply people's water exposure. And so this brings me to our next question, where one of our participants, Dr. Frank, has many patients who use wells for drinking water, and there can be significant cost for water quality testing. And he's part of the tribal nation, and the tribe community does have some testing access, but for non-tribe patients who are low income, do you have any suggestions on low-cost testing options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for raising the important point about equity and cost, and all of those things are a little out of my purview, but I am aware of some programs, particularly in states. Again, I'm thinking about nitrate. I'm aware of some programs, for instance, in Nebraska, that offer low-cost measurement options for homeowners that qualify, et cetera. So yes, I do think that those programs probably do exist in many places at the state or local level, and it's worth investigating. I also think even outside of the programs, many state and local health departments will just be responsive to concerns. Like if you communicate with them, I'm worried about my water, where can I have it tested? They will help coordinate with you. That's a big part of their mission. So, but so I can't speak to your area specifically, but yes, those programs do exist. And I think we can agree that's an excellent way to make sure that people are feeling heard, and, that they can have the same access to some of these, answers, so to speak.
Yeah, perfect. And we will, the MyCares team will definitely do some looking into what options exist for testing and get that out to all of our participants. So thanks for that question. Then I'll pivot to another question, kind of more broadly about water contamination, because we often think about drinking water. You mentioned kind of the lack of research around showering and bathing and swimming pool use exposure. But also, what about fish consumption, for example, which is a really important source of food for many people in Michigan?
Yeah, another really thought-provoking question. So my context for this answer, I did my graduate studies in New York, where there had been a long history of contamination by GE in the Hudson River, which was a major food source for many low-income communities, just fishing out of the water. And the major contaminant there, and it was PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls and dioxins and other kinds of chemicals that are, they like fat. So they reside in the fatty part of the fish and they stick around, and then you eat it and you eat the fatty part of the fish and they stay in your body. So much like PFAS, they're very biologically persistent because they are lipophilic, or they bind to fat. And so those kinds of compounds that, sort of have an affinity for fat and stay in fish like that are certainly something of real concern. And I think one of the things that happened in New York, and again, this is some time ago when I was there were fish advisories frequently to warn people not to consume the fish out of the river at certain times of the year where the sediment was getting stirred up and the chemicals were coming to the surface. They would also encourage people to not recreate on the river at that time. So, you can, again, that volatilization of some of those chemicals, you can they become airborne and you can inhale them. So I think it's an excellent question, and it's the sort of local contamination of the body of water and, any sort of monitoring that's being done in the fish in that source of water are good things to sort of keep an eye on when considering how relevant that's going to be to a specific population.
Super, super helpful. These are very important equity discussions because many people don't have the luxury of deciding they won't eat recreationally caught fish. So,
right.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. We have another question about whether it's safe to drink water straight out of the tap without any filtration. And I think I will just broadly say that that's going to be very area specific, but maybe you can talk kind of more broadly about your experience, and also kind of if you know about how the often testing occurs. And
so I realize it's very easy to say, these key contaminants are regulated, and so you should feel comfortable drinking out of your public drinking water supply. But the reality is that violations do occur, and not for necessarily due to anybody's misbehavior or anything like that. Just maintaining a high quality drinking water actually is a very complicated process. People, there's frequent testing usually at a public water supply. They're constantly sort of monitoring that and running tests. And the frequency of measurement is actually dictated under the Safe Drinking Water Act for every chemical. And so, for instance, nitrate has to be measured at a minimum once a year or quarterly if you're in an area where there's a lot of nitrate contamination or where there have been elevations above the MCL in the past. So it's kind of like if you have a history of elevations, you have to continue to monitor to show that you've resolved it, basically, right? But in the broader sense, assuming that a public water utility, and I can't speak to Ann Arbor's water, I'm sorry, other than the taste, it tastes lovely. I drank it when I was there. Other than just making the assumption, it's on a public water utility, it's probably meeting SIDWA, Safe Drinking Water Standard, minimums. That would theoretically mean that it's safe with respect to those specific chemicals to drink it out of the tap. And I'll just kind of throw out there, because I could anticipate this is a follow-up question. I've gotten this question many times. Do you filter your water? Do I filter my water at home? Do I drink water out of the tap? I do. I drink water out of the tap. I do filter my water for nitrate. I use reverse osmosis. Maybe that's an artifact of doing too many nitrate studies. But generally, I feel comfortable drinking my water out of the tap. And I get my drinking water from DC, in case anybody's wondering. So, I would say on average, from a public drinking water supply, it's probably pretty safe. But we have to acknowledge the caveat that there are violations, and they are hopefully addressed quickly due to routine monitoring.
And, of course, being here in Michigan, we know that there have been significant issues with water in Flint and Benton Harbor. And so I think for people who live in Michigan, this is really on their mind quite rightly. And
I think that's understandable.
Yeah. Just similar along those lines, could you talk a little bit about hard water versus soft water, and whether that makes a difference in exposure?
I was staring at that question in the chat, like, okay. Because here we're talking about kind of the water as a mixture. We're thinking about things like pH and, maybe how much metal component is in it and that kind of stuff. But it's hard to use that as a way to sort of talk about cancer risk, because we really kind of look at these things like one chemical at a time. Like, Now, to my knowledge, the specific pH of drinking water is not linked to cancer risk, or hasn't been in studies. So I can't really speak to that. But I don't know that there's been great evidence to suggest that there's differences in cancer risk among communities that have hard versus soft water. I think, as I showed you, there's relatively few studies even of the contaminants, though. So I would just caution to say the absence of evidence could just be an artifact of it not being well studied. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I see the question about arsenic contamination. There's a related question, do we know even less about the health effects of arsenic contaminated water? And I'll just note that arsenic has probably been among the more well-studied drinking water contaminants and has been linked to bladder cancer, skin cancer, and lung cancer specifically.
Yeah, so I was looking at that question too, thinking it is in fact what we maybe know some of the most about in terms of impact. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Dr. Jones, but in Ann Arbor, we have this dioxane plume that is moving kind of through and affecting groundwater supplies. I can't remember, honestly, if we've talked about this before or if you have any thoughts on kind of impact and even ideas around the kinds, I of course think my cares is, the right way to study these questions and will really help us really fill in some of this knowledge, but you may have thoughts on other specific studies that could be done.
Thank you for the question. So I am aware of, I have an affiliation at the Yale School of Public Health, and they have a newly awarded grant to study 1,4-dioxane and health effects, because there's a similar plume, I guess, in the Northeast, and even maybe down in Florida, if I'm remembering correctly. And in being involved in conversations in very early days, now I don't pretend to be fully knowledgeable of the full scope of the work they're doing, but being involved in the early conversations, I remember discussing some of the challenges in studying that chemical in particular in relation to health outcomes, period. And one of the reasons is same thing that I was sort of parroting in my talk, limited measurement data, like for PFAS. But also, even if we wanted to measure it in the human body, there are no long-term biomarkers of this chemical. It does not stick around in the body for very long. So it's hard to say, oh, well, even if we can't measure it in water, we could measure the people in the community. We could measure something in their blood or their urine. But this is not a chemical, to my knowledge, that is really conducive to that. So there are some challenges in just sort of characterizing exposure in the population to be able to look at health outcomes. But I do know it's a very active area of research. And so I expect that will change and evolve in the coming years.
Super. Thinking about things staying in the body, is there a way that one can lower the PFAS that is in their body?
It's very interesting. So there is some I always think about, modifiable versus not modifiable risk factors. So ways that PFAS are eliminated from your body are excretion through blood, breast milk. So like a lactating mother actually is eliminating PFAS by nursing her child. Now she may be giving her child some of that exposure, which is our hypothesis underlying some of the childhood cancer work. Menstruation is another way that PFAS are excreted from the body. So older women who are no longer menstruating actually have higher levels of PFAS in the body on average than younger women. But in terms of actively, doing something like, could I do something to lower my, reduce the amount that I have in my body today? I don't think there are really too many feasible suggestions there.
It is hard when there are not frustrating when there are no recommendations for actions that people can take. So
right.
it does show how important it is to understand the impact, because then we could, in theory, maybe have different screening approaches if there are cancers we can screen for that are higher among people with higher exposures, things like that. All right, so it looks like we've done all of the current questions. Does anyone else have a question before we close today? Okay, well, I really want to thank you, Dr. Jones, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge, and always being willing to share your knowledge. Many of you probably don't know that Dr. Jones has been out to Michigan quite a few times over the last couple of years, meeting with people in Flint as we think about how to understand exposures related to the water crisis and more broadly environmental justice or injustice that's decades old, and more broadly as the MyCare Teams expands its efforts across the state. We look forward to tapping into your expertise even more and appreciate your willingness.
Sure. The honor is mine. It's really nice to feel like, your work is impactful and helping people. So I'm really, really happy to be part of it.
Great. Thanks. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We will be in touch with our next webinar for May, and look forward to all of you joining us again.
Thanks so much.